It's a really unfair comparison, because if we look at the research money that has gone into production systems, and the conventional system has gotten billions and billions and billions of dollars of research to help fine-tune it and move it forward. Organic systems have gotten a pittance, maybe 1 or 2% at best. And we're also trying to understand very complex systems, so they're long-term projects. And so you're saying, it's kind of like saying, oh, the kid that went through school is better educated. Well, yeah, because they went through school. So you've gone through all this research, and then you're saying, oh yeah, this production system is better. Well, what if we put that money into organic research? Where would we end up? I mean, even with the pittance we put in, I look at tree fruit production. How many organic practices have now been adopted by the conventional industry? Cover crops, mating disruption, biological control. All these were pioneered on organic farms and are now widespread and normal practices. So instead of saying organic can't keep up and just making that presumption, why don't we say, look at how well organic has kept up despite the fact that it's not funded.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. You just heard from Steve Ela, a familiar voice if you listen to our show, and a not too far off neighbor of mine who also farms on the western slopes of Colorado. Steve is a true champion of big picture, holistic thinking on his tree fruit farm, implementing many innovative pest control practices, and he's used this integrated thinking while he was on the National Organic Standards Board as well. So he was one of the Soil 7 NOSB members that voted to keep the soil in organic farming. And today he shares a bit more about that time in his life, as well as his current thoughts on the encroachment of hydroponics into organic, and some of the great benefits real organic farming and soil stewardship can bring to all.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm talking with Steve Ela today. This is our second interview with you, and I think we have a Know Your Farmer interview as well. The first interview was my co-director, Linley Dixon, did. It was excellent. I told you I listened to it as I drove to this conference today. You all covered a lot of ground, and I want to touch base on some of the things that you talked about there. We had a great conversation earlier with Eric Seidman. So Steve, just to remind people, I really encourage you to go back and listen to that interview again. It was excellent. It was probably 4 years old by now, 3 years old. It was during COVID that it took place.
That's right. Yep.
And I got to know Steve through his service on the National Organic Standards Board. And I was a farmer who started going to meetings, and I really felt like a baby when I walked into. The first thing I did was the NOC meeting, the National Organic Coalition meeting, which is always the day before the NOSB begins, National Organic Standards Board. And I was stunned by all these people, fairly well dressed up in this room, and they all knew each other. And there were a lot of them, like 60 people, and I didn't know any of them. And then the next day there was the NOSB meeting, and we were talking about hydroponics. This was back in Vermont. It was the meeting in what's that, Shelburne? No, it was, Gene Richardson was so proud to have the meeting in Vermont.
So that would have been the year before I was on the board.
That was the year before you
so
came.
I was not on, yeah.
So yeah, I really actually kind of vividly remember the part of going in to the NOC meeting, and all these folks were there. And we had a rally. We had a rally about organic at that meeting at lunchtime. We were careful not to interrupt the proceedings, so Gene was concerned. So you came on the next year, and that would have been what year?
2017. So my first meeting was Denver,
Okay.
and then the following meeting was the Jacksonville meeting in that fall.
Okay. All right.
So I got to enter right at the peak of the discussion, I guess.
Yeah, the hot spot. Because actually I went for meetings even for a full year and a half before that, talking about this issue.
Yeah, and certainly I echo. I mean, farmer from Western Colorado. I had never really known exactly what the NOSB did, so I probably foolishly applied. But partly I'd been on the Organic Farming Research Foundation board, and a number of people from that board had gone to the NOSB, and so it seemed of interest, and I enjoyed that sort of thing. So there I was. But my first meeting, I walked into the room and I didn't know anybody either. A few people from OFRF, Organic Farm Research Foundation, but it was all new people as well. And so, and I'm not great with names. I'm great with relationships, but not names. And so it was a active learning curve.
Yeah. I would say to people that there's a group of farmers and some people from nonprofits who are involved in a lot of these activities, like OFRF and the NOSB, the endless initials, which are totally confusing to people who haven't spent time there. But I have great respect for that group who have become very knowledgeable about these issues. And these are really, these are political issues about how are we going to define organic? And how are we not going to define organic?
Yeah.
Could you talk just briefly to explain to people who don't understand, what do you see as the role of this advisory board?
I mean, when I talk to people about the National Organic Standards Board, I gave a talk yesterday about it. And partly the reason I try and give talks on it is to get people engaged, because being a member of the board, and like I say, I walked into it not really knowing what it was going to be. And the longer I was on the board, the comforting part was I realized, I don't have to be the expert. I don't have to be the most knowledgeable person in the room. We just have to ask the community and those are the most knowledgeable people in the room or in the country. And so the best thing the NOSB can do is to reach out and ask questions of the organic community and then get that input and then try and digest that. Because I don't know how many times, I would think I'd write a document to put out there and I think, this is great. I really nailed it. And you get public comments back and you're like, wow, no, they nailed it. Here, they bring up the deep thinkers, the thought processes, the wording would be better this way. And, a lot of times absolutely right. That it was better from that public iterative process. It means things don't happen quickly, but it is. I guess I'm a believer in that kind of democracy, that the more people that participate in that board and in the board dynamics, the better reflective of the organic community it's going to be. Because I think you've noted, yes, there are groups that pay people to be there. I am now part-time on the staff of the National Organic Coalition, so they help fund me to go to the board meetings. But individuals and people that aren't those groups also have every right to be there, and their voice is just as important. They get the equal amount of time and public comments. And as a board member, I listen to the big groups, but I listen to those individuals too, because they're the people on the ground. They're the people doing it. And I think, a lot of that just practical experience is really useful.
So I say a part of me was reacting going, sometimes I think it doesn't matter what the National Organic Standards Board advises, because the USDA frequently ignores it. And I think actually Organic Trade Association pointed out that they'd gone 10 years without acting on a single recommendation, moving it to rulemaking. That was a part of the decade you were there.
Okay.
And I was surprised. I think that it was a true statement, and I hadn't realized how many of your recommendations that you'd spent so much work on were just ignored. Were you discouraged by that?
I take it with a grain of salt. I saw several roles for the NOSB. And one is to give recommendations that are acted on. And there, as you noted, there may have been a drought there. I don't know about that or specifically, but we've got some major recommendations through now with strengthening organic enforcement and organic livestock, poultry practices, and origin of livestock. Some other minor ones, if we look at paper pots and some of these other ones, there are things that have gone through. But I also see, and it is discouraging at times to make recommendations and not have them go forward, and that can be frustrating. But I also believe that it's okay for the board. That frustration is there, but it is okay for the board to make recommendations that may not go forward, because then they're on the books. And there has been a public debate on this, and at some point in the future, there is this reference point of these discussions and this placeholder of history that the board can look at and say, well, we talked about this 7 years ago, and refer to that and then move forward. And the other thing is, unless there's a recommendation, a NOSB recommendation on the books, it gives no traction for other groups like National Organic Coalition or Organic Farming Research Foundation or even OTA or any of these to then push the National Organic Program to pass it. So you have to have those recommendations sitting there and say, we should go to rulemaking with this. And even if they sit there for a while, it's still, it's a placeholder. So I get frustrated that some of those aren't moved to rulemaking, and on the other hand, they create space that wouldn't be there otherwise.
The recommendation that, of course, we were talking about, it was the issue of hydroponics that brought me to the NOSB meetings, and I had never been to such a meeting. I was almost I was a very solitary farmer with my family and the farm, but I really didn't get out much. And when I saw that hydroponics were being certified as organic, it was very disturbing to me that something that was so opposed to the principles of organic would be considered. Could you talk about the principles of organic and why hydroponic might not make sense in that world?
I mean, obviously, I was one of the group that was opposing hydroponics. So we agree in principle already. As an organic grower, and I grow perennial fruit trees, so there is no hydroponic production for that. And obviously, one of the reasons I like being a grower is because of the perennial aspect. And part of my background is in geology as well. So it's like long-term thinking. And to me, and then my other background is ecosystems, which fascinate me. And if I could have been an ecologist, I probably would have been in a different walk of life. So to me, as I moved from conventional to organic, the shift in thinking from magic bullets or single source choices to thinking of how we manage an ecosystem, made a lot of sense. And it was also very natural, and it was very lovely, because I love thinking about the whole system and how little things change in a system and how it affects the big system. And coming back to being perennials, we have to think long term anyhow, because we plant a tree and may not pick a crop from it for 6 years. And everything we do is not just for this year's production, but for next year's and the following year's production. So we're thinking multi-year all the time. And so to me, soil being the basis made a lot of sense, because it is part of that ecosystem, and it is part of the buffer of that system. It holds nutrients, it adds them, it subtracts them, but it creates a more even flow that takes out peaks and valleys. And it's the same whether we're talking biological control of insects or other things. These buffers are really important, and a perennial tree is highly buffered. It's got nutrients held in the wood. So you might not see a deficiency for 3 years if there's a deficiency. But yet, to me, the soil really was the critical basis. And I can tell a story of, I got out of grad school in soils, came back to the farm. It was when high-density fruit planting systems are really coming into vogue. So you're moving to these much more tightly spaced trees that came into production earlier, dwarfing rootstocks. And part of the deal with that is you plant them and you need to get them to grow and fill the space very quickly. So you're trying to get the tree to fertilize it heavily to get it to grow. Colorado has some kind of interesting soils. They don't always fit the books very well. And where we grow, they're fertile, but they're not fertile. And so we would plant these trees and they weren't growing like we expected. And so you add more nitrogen. We actually went up to some very high nitrogen rates for a while, and we still weren't seeing the nitrogen response, which means, okay, there's another limiting factor. So, we looked, soil tests all came back fine. Everything was peachy keen there, but the trees weren't expressing that. So, you try potassium, you try phosphorus, you try manganese, these various things. And after kind of rooting around for 5 or 6 years, with the human hubris of I can figure this out, I didn't figure it out. And I don't know what the limiting factor was, why we weren't seeing those nitrogen responses. And that experience of like, I'm fresh out of school, I've got all this knowledge, I can't figure it out, really brought me back into the soil mantra of organics of build the soil, and realizing that this ecosystem is so complex that my brain can't understand it. And so putting a tree in a healthy soil and letting all these nutrient interactions happen continuously so that the tree can feed when it wants to feed, not when I decide it should feed, really became, it was driven into me because I couldn't figure it out otherwise. And so I think the soil is the basis because it's this dynamic thing that's releasing and taking up nutrients. It's the smorgasbord for the tree roots. And in a hydroponic system, we're assuming we know what those plants need all the time, and we're giving it to them. And I don't think we do.
Yeah. People ask me if we've seen nutritional comparisons of hydroponic, organic, so-called organic, certified organic, and soil-based organic in blueberries or tomatoes. And I say, well, of course the tests would show a difference, but the sobering thing is we have no idea what the food should be. We have no idea. We've identified 100,000 compounds in plants. We don't know what most of them do. We don't have names for them. We certainly don't know how they interact, and we don't know how they interact with us. Yeah. So how are we going to say what's optimal or what's suboptimal?
Yeah. And I think, as I talk about organics now, when we do farm tours and things, I really look at, the revolutions. We in the 50s, my granddad was growing tree fruits. Worms were a huge issue. They were spraying lead arsenate, and not even all that effective. They would pack, clean fruit, 1 worm fruit, and 2 worm fruit. Those were actual grades. And my granddad would guarantee his fruit. And he said, if you buy a 2 worm fruit and there's only 1 worm in it, bring it back. I'll give you one with 2. But that was the fight they had. Was that it wasn't lead arsenate wasn't really controlling it. So when DDT came out, of course it was a miracle drug. Suddenly you had clean fruit, and I can see why people went after that. Well, we realized down the road all the issues of that. But that was the chemical revolution. It was also the space program where we thought we could manufacture foods. You had space sticks, you had Tang, all these things, and that's when ingredients, expanded into, all the names that we don't know. And I think at this point now, and this is my pitch for organics, is we're in the biological revolution. So we had the chemical revolution. We realized that doesn't always work. We get on the chemical treadmill, and that these fake foods don't actually feed us. And so now we're going back, and whether we're with wastewater treatment, we're using biological systems. With heavy metals, we're using biological systems. If we're even talking about the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of that oil got eaten up by biological mechanisms. And so I think now we're moving from the chemical revolution to the biological revolution. And it also is true in food as well. It's not just agriculture, but agriculture produces food, but we realized we can't manufacture fake food. We still have people out there trying to do it, but it's not the wholesome food that really feeds us. And so I think, coming back to your point, we assume we can add all the nutrients into a hydroponic system that are needed, but of those 100,000 plant compounds, yeah, we don't have any idea what are really important and what the mixtures and what the subtleties are. We can have the basic box, but do we actually have nutrition? Because I don't even think we understand nutrition.
I don't think so either, Steve. I've been amazed. I've been talking to some of the people in the food as medicine movement, and God bless them. I agree completely. Their big thing is to turn people away from ultra-processed junk food and have them buy food and eat that instead. And they're so much healthier. There's so many benefits and positive aspects to their lives and to our whole system, our whole society, our healthcare system. But it seems to me that the curiosity needs to grow and say, well, is a carrot a carrot? Is this carrot the same as that carrot? Or do they have perhaps a significant difference in the impact on the person who eats them?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, and I think we always forget the psychological effects too. We always want to be mechanistic and just look at chemicals. But, you know, food we eat multiple times a day. You can either do it without thinking about it or you can do it with thinking about it. Food brings pleasure. And for a lot of people, food doesn't bring pleasure. We have a society that says just shove it down your face and get on with the day. But you think a lot of societies where you sit down to eat and you look at your food and you inhale it and you take it in with your eyes. And that's all part of human health. You know, we can't divorce the psychological from the physical. And so I really feel like, you know, uniform food, a tomato that's all the same is kind of boring, you know, on the plate. But when you have different colors and different shapes and different textures, it engages your brain as you eat. And so as you're tasting things, it creates curiosity and excitement or blah, I don't like that. And I mean, being an apple grower, I love growing all these varieties because there can be varieties that I think are inedible. And invariably somebody comes up and is like, that is so good, because we're all different. And we're not one, we're a species, but we're not all clones. And I think that's the other thing is we need to remember is all these different variations bring different things to different people.
I was listening yesterday to a Senate hearing. Bernie Sanders was conducting it, but it was a whole committee. And they were talking with the head of the FDA. And he actually said, the head of the FDA actually said that the food processing companies are now actually able to make food that is addictive. And that they know how to do this. You know, our scientists are very good at teasing apart how to play with our centers of craving. And I thought that was interesting to hear a leading scientist say that, you know, junk food is addictive. Mm-hmm. So it's not so simple how to handle an addictive substance. It's not easy to ban it. Yep. Tremendous lobbying power of these organizations. And yet the consequences for all of us are great. Yeah. It's not just the people even who choose to eat the junk food, if it is a choice, but you know, everybody's paying for the health care. We're facing genuine crises of obesity and diabetes that appear to me that it's going to be unsustainable as a society.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, healthy food is just a fundamental human value. And, you know, we're very fortunate where we live that we have lots of access to food. We're not hungry, but I think there is the real question, do we have access to real food? And it comes back, we talked a little bit earlier a bit about value. And so much of our society is taken as value as the most for the cheapest, most volume for the cheapest price. But I think we need to relook at what value means, because it used to be value was getting some equation of getting the best thing for the best price. It wasn't the most in volume. You know, at some point we got co-opted into bigger is better, and more volume is something, and we get lost that actually, what are we paying for? So this may be really cheap and we may be getting a lot of volume, but there may not be much there. And so we'd actually be better to pay twice the price for something that's nutrient dense. And that comes back to foods. I mean, if you're going to have a tomato that tastes like cardboard, okay, I can get 10 pounds for $3. Cool. Or can I get 3 tomatoes that make me happy and that I eat and puts a smile on my face for the same price? Well, which is the better value? In terms of real value. And I think we need to look at that more. And I'm really worried that our food system, we have moved people away from taste and enjoyment and to just consumption. And how much can we consume?
There are a lot of talking points that have been developed to attack organic. And one of them is it's the food of liberal elites. And another is that the world is going to starve unless we grow food in a heavy industrial chemical way. And I don't believe either of those, but they're effective ways of confusing the conversation. So let's I'd love to talk about the liberal elite thing because it really pisses me off. But let's talk about the world's going to starve. And we had talked about this article in the New York Times this weekend called "Sorry, but This is the Future of Food." It was an opinion piece by Michael Grunwald. And its basic point is that if we don't go to large-scale industrial agriculture, the world will starve. It's an old story. I mean, it's that line has been said for a long time. What's your response to that?
I mean, when I left the NOSB, it was part of my final goodbye. But it's so I went to grad school at the University of Minnesota. I was in Borlaug Hall. Borlaug was the father of the Green Revolution. We were in the basement, how fitting. But in my undergrad work, I also really looked at the Green Revolution and, all the readings on that and recognized a lot of the literature of it's not just production, it's distribution. And I think Francis Moore-Lepay really nailed that. And that was enlightening to me of like, this isn't a food quantity problem, it's a food access problem. And I think we're still there. We have, one farmer feeds, 75 people and all these things. It's like, but they don't. They feed X number of people. You can take the raw numbers and do that math, but it's actually not true. A lot of people in the world, even with this big ag, are still starving and don't have access to good food. And even in the United States, that we have the food deserts where it's not there. And so until we really address the problem of food access and food distribution, quantity doesn't matter. I mean, we need some, certainly. There can be starvation easily, but I think it's a straw man. And that argument is designed to say, no, we just have to maximize everything at all costs, instead of saying, really, what is the cost and where are we paying for it? And I mean, the other thing I talk about as an organic grower is, why does organic cost a little more? And my response is because I'm internalizing costs that other people get to externalize. I'm not causing soil erosion that clogs the riverways and causes issues with water treatment, or you have to dredge the Mississippi. I'm not contributing to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and I'm not contributing to Midwest cities having to treat water for nitrates and pesticides. All that money is being paid for by your tax dollars. So you're paying for it. It's just in a different way. And in my organic fruit, I'm trying to keep all those costs on the farm and as part of the food. So coming back to value or costs or things, I don't think there's that much difference. It's just where we're paying for it. Are we paying for it in our taxes and in all the things we have to do to mitigate things, or are we paying for it in the food up front?
Okay, that's actually a pretty big statement. And as somebody pointed out in the conversation earlier, on top of that, they're subsidizing that farming, that commodity farming, on top of paying for all the unintended consequences.
Exactly. And this author, I mean, he's going right down the standard, talking points, tick, 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 tick. But it ignores those externalities. And it's like, yeah, we can produce more food, but there's a cost. The Midwest can't last forever if we keep eroding soil and we keep polluting it. it's got really deep soils. It's lasted quite a while, but it's not a given it'll be there forever. And I think of, the Iowa floods we were driving across. It's probably been 15 or 20 years ago when they had huge rains and things, and gullies were cut across fields, and the organic farms were intact. No gullies, water didn't run off. What's the cost of all that flooding from those conventional farms? And so I think, it's great to take production in itself, but you're not looking at it as part of a whole system again. Anytime you want to take one little piece out and say, oh, we have to do this, you're making the mistake of not looking at the big picture. And I think the big picture, we really need to step back and say, what are all the costs? What are all the inputs? What's the human suffering from pesticide plants, from workers exposure, from farm exposure?
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, part of that runoff from Iowa has created Cancer Alley down in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And, people are dying because of the way people are farming somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. Could you talk about what's the mindset for you? You've literally gone from being a conventional chemical farmer to being an organic farmer. And could you describe how you thought about problems when you were a chemical farmer? Because the way that we live affects how we think about problems, and the way that we make a living certainly affects it. So you had one mindset, maybe a mindset that was concerned, but you had a mindset of how to approach problems that is that system. And then you've got a different mindset that you learned and developed as a result of becoming an organic farmer. Could you describe those two mindsets?
Yeah, no, it's kind of cool. It's fun to have hindsight. So if you had talked to me in my 20s and, all the mind problems where you give, it's the thing of the solution is obvious, but you have to think laterally to get to it. I failed. Like, I'd be in a room and 10 people would get the answer like that. And I'd be like, and I wouldn't get it because I thought very linearly. And I think, one, being a farmer in general, but then especially being an organic farmer where you don't have magic bullet fixes, where you have to think as a system, has totally changed my thought process to thinking extremely laterally. My mom always said growing up, and she grew up in the Depression where they had nothing, literally nothing. And my granddad always said, well, if something breaks, you can usually look around and within 10 feet, there will be something that you can use to fix it with. It may not be pretty, but it can get you by. And I think that, just taking that analogy, that's how I think now. Okay, we have a problem here. Well, let's think around the edges. How can we work with that problem? And that, again, comes back to thinking like an ecosystem. And it's usually not just one solution. It might be putting 3 or 4 things together. And so I had that very linear thinking, and working in organic systems where you have to think bigger picture. You have to think broader. You have to think multiple ways to solve a problem, because each one isn't going to be the magic fix, has taught me to think completely differently now. And I love that. It makes life a lot more fun. And, it's like I like doing crossword puzzles because I love the play on words. You read it and you're like, oh, this is what it means. No, they twisted it. And so the ability to play with that and have fun with it is enjoyable. But I think we live in a society that wants to be very linear. You do this and this happens. And we don't recognize the external effects and the other effects, the hidden effects that we see. And
do you think that's the essence of the science of ecology?
I think so.
Is just this seeing the amazing infinite connections and start to understand that there are no simple systems in that way.
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of ecology. And I was an intern at the Land Institute in West Jackson and Wendell Berry. They would often get into discussions, and I think it was Wendell that said, and it could have been West too, but the discussion of humans, we're really uncomfortable with what we don't know. We don't like that. And so we want to label everything. And then the things we don't know or that seem random, we say, oh, that's random because we don't understand it. Well, it's not often not random because, as we go through science, we start to understand more of these systems and suddenly, oh, we thought that was random. No, it actually is a very finely tuned system. And I think that colored my thought as well of like, oh yeah, we should be uncomfortable with what we don't know. And we should experience the discomfort and not be scared of it, but just continue to look at it. I also had a professor as an undergrad, and the theory of science, and one of the things is there is no proof. You can only disprove things. You can't actually prove them, because there can always be one more data point that doesn't fit the paradigm. And it's the points that don't fit the paradigm that are especially interesting, because they're real, they're not fake. So they're the things that make you look at what you think is the norm and say it doesn't quite fit. And so I think ecology looks at that. It takes in all the tips and tails of the bell curve, and that's part of the system. And that's where change happens, is out on those edges. I think the organic industry, we're out on the tip or the tail. I think we're on the tip, personally. We're ahead of the curve. But that's where change happens and innovation happens, because you don't have all the other comforts of all the other tools. And so when I talk about a biological revolution, I think the organic growers are on the lead of that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I had no idea that ecology was such a recent science as a formal science. I think it was 1870, somewhere around there, that somebody in Germany started to coin that term and created this study of systems. And I know George Washington Carver around late 1890s was, studying ecology with some of the people who were the first generation. He was the second generation of ecologists in America. And of course, he was a pioneer of what we would call organic farming. Now, that word wasn't applied to it then, but it was exactly what he was teaching.
Well, I mean, look at indigenous farming systems, honed over thousands of years of, I'm just going to say, observation. And that's often a lot of the key is sitting back. I mean, one of the fruit growers that I first met when I came back to the farm was up in Washington, and he was talking about pruning trees. And, every apple variety has its own form. Some are weepy, some are stiff. And he said, I'd let the tree tell me. I'll try something, and then I sit back and I look at it, and what was the effect? Instead of like, I know what I'm going to do, and I'm going to prune this way, I'm going to hone it into this shape. No, he let the tree talk back to him. And that was really sage advice. And I think there again, ecosystems, watch, observe, let it talk back to you, and then change.
Yeah. So this makes me think, I don't know if you ever read that Nature article. It's a fairly famous article in which they looked at some fields, I think it was in Sweden or Finland, and they were comparing the yield of a conventional grain and the same grain grown organically. And they saw that the conventional chemical field had a higher yield of something like 20% of this particular grain in this particular situation. And based on that, they made the extrapolation that organic was less productive, and consequently, to grow the same amount of food was going to take 20% more land. And to get that land with an expanding population, we would have to clear cut the Amazon and get rid of the forest and kill the engine of carbon sequestration. And this was told to me, the first time I heard of this article was from the chair of an environmental studies program at Dartmouth College, who said, of course, organic agriculture is much worse for the climate than conventional. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I was like, what are you thinking? So that's what he was talking about. I'm just curious, do you have thoughts about the thinking process that came to that conclusion, and what might they be leaving out?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I think, it's taking a data point and saying this proves the point, instead of taking data points and say what doesn't prove this point. So it's trying to make proof where you can't actually prove something. I can look at my own production. I can grow an organic peach and be competitive with a conventional peach grower on yield. I just talked to our crop insurance agent this fall and turned in my production figures, and she's like, oh, your organic yields on apples are the same as the conventional ones. I would have said they were lower just because we have various reasons, but no, there's her response. She sees all the production figures for our locality, and we were right in the ballpark. So I think you can cherry pick. You can say, you can pick a crop that organic has lower yields. You can pick a crop that organic has higher yields. But I'm also going to say it's a really unfair comparison, because if we look at the research money that has gone into production systems, and the conventional system has gotten billions and billions and billions of dollars of research to help fine-tune it and move it forward. Organic systems have gotten a pittance, maybe 1 or 2% at best. And we're also trying to understand very complex systems, so they're long-term projects. And so you're saying, it's kind of like saying, oh, the kid that went through school is better educated. Well, yeah, because they went through school. So you've gone through all this research, and then you're saying, oh yeah, this production system is better. Well, what if we put that money into organic research? Where would we end up? I mean, even with the pittance we put in, I look at tree fruit production, how many organic practices have now been adopted by the conventional industry? Cover crops, mating disruption, biological control, all these were pioneered on organic farms and are now widespread and normal practices. So instead of saying organic can't keep up and just making that presumption, why don't we say, look at how well organic has kept up despite the fact that it's not funded. I mean, that's amazing that we are competitive even. A Formula One car on the racetrack going against a Model T, and yet the Model T is keeping pace with it. And I don't mean the model organic is old. It's just that we haven't had that benefit of all that research, and so it's really frustrating to hear, that we're not good enough, because we are, and we are keeping up remarkably well.
That's great. I actually hadn't even thought of it from that perspective. Are there other perspectives that might also... I'm so troubled by the idea that it is better for the climate to manufacture nitrogen in a factory at tremendous energetic cost, and then to put it on the soil, burning out the organic matter, and then because the whole system is impoverished, we're going to hit it with pesticides, and because of the weeds, we're going to hit it with herbicides, which are going through the roof right now because of GMO breeding.
Yep.
And all of that, the punchline to this that this article had is, that's better than your farm, which doesn't use any of the toxins, which is mostly, not entirely, but mostly self-fed. What's wrong with that? How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely still buy some off-farm inputs. We're trying to minimize that. Yeah. That's part of my goal, is how can we get rid of a lot of those. But I mean, let's just be lazy. I'm a busy person, and so and we all are, and there are more things to do in the day than I have time for. So why would I go out and load up a sprayer and spray something when I can not do it and let a ladybug or a lacewing or a Daryocris or a earwig do the job for me? And they're on call 24 hours a day. Why would I buy nitrogen when I can plant a legume and just pull it right out of the air? And I don't have to do a thing. I don't have to drive the tractor through. I don't have to spread it. All I have to do is try and work with the system to try and help manage it. And I think that's, we're control freaks. We want to have absolute control and absolute precision, and we need to let go of that, because Mother Nature does a lot of this really well. There's some things she doesn't. I mean, we have worms in our apples, and they're not going to be biologically controlled at this point. So we do need to control those. But if we control those, let's not screw up the rest of the system where Mother Nature is doing our work for us. And that, that's just like, work less, let her do more. And I think we need to learn that. And it comes back to paying attention and watching and not screwing things up. It's again, comes back to hubris. Let's just be humble and say, we don't know everything. Right. And then observe. And I think a lot of the generalists, we talked about ecology in the 1870s or wherever, but a lot of the generalists, early scientists, were observers and trying to figure out, why did that happen? Why did this happen? And they watched and they took things in. And we need to keep doing more of that.
Yeah. Thank you. Science is a funny word. It gets bandied about a lot, and it's used a lot in chemical agriculture. When you read their literature of why people should choose to use a lot of chemistry. And in fact, it's used as an attack against organic, saying organic is unscientific. And I always think that's not true.
It's the problem with science is doesn't do well with multivariate analysis. Most science projects have one variable, change one thing. That works really well with conventional agriculture because you're not looking at the rest of the system. You're just saying, if I add more of X, do I get more of Y? Add more nitrogen, I get more yield. But it doesn't look at any of the other aspects of soil erosion or carbon emissions or whatever. And ecology, that science was developed for multivariate analysis. And it's still tough to take a system and analyze the effects on multiple things. But let's just take a fruit blossom in the spring that's in full bloom and we've got a cold weather system coming in. And you can do freeze tests on that and figure out when it's going to frost. And it's a bell curve because not all blossoms are made the same. But what happens to that blossom before that changes the outcome. And so if we have a string of 80-degree days and we're suddenly going to go to 25 degrees, that blossom's going to get smoked. It's going to be killed. But I've seen fruit blossoms where we've had cool days where we've been right at 29 or 30 for multiple nights, and maybe the day only gets up to 30 or 40, and those blossoms come through 25 degrees with no problem. Same blossom, same temperatures, and if you do those scientific studies and just look at one variable, you're going to get a result. But if you look at the rest of what has affected that blossom beforehand, you get a very different result. And so I think that's science as well. And we have to be cautious. It's really easy and cheap to do single variable studies, and it's really costly and long term to do multivariate studies. But the multivariate studies give us a lot more information.
Yeah. And those single variable studies are powerful. We do learn things.
We do.
But the problem is there's a lot we don't learn.
Yeah. And and as a fruit grower, because there's so much we don't know about what affects a fruit blossom or what affects a root in the soil, we want to just take those single variables and say, add more nitrogen is better. But as you noted, maybe that destroys adding that much straight urea destroys our biome. And 4 years down the road, we're now on a treadmill that we didn't know we'd even started. And that's what's hard to measure. And so it's not that it's not scientific, it's just much more complex.
Yes, it's what Stuart Hill calls deep science.
Deep science, yeah.
And as opposed to shallow science. He said shallow science is where you take a mouse, you give it a shot of something, and you see what happens.
Yep.
And deep science is where you're talking, as you are, about this mouse in an incredibly complex ecosystem and how is it reacting, behaving, and being healthy or unhealthy.
How's it interacting with its other mice?
With its other mice, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. So
great. So maybe we're getting there, but a question. You are certified with the Real Organic Project. You also work with the National Organic Coalition. You've done a lot of work with the National Organic Standards Board and with OFRF, Organic Farming Research Foundation. I'm curious from these different perspectives. Certainly, NOSB and National Organic Coalition are primarily focused, NOSB entirely focused on regulatory management and reform. And you're still working hard at that with National Organic Coalition. Real Organic Project does work on regulatory reform. We haven't abandoned it, but I would say that our focus is in fact on creating an alternative to what is at the moment a failed regulatory apparatus. And what are your thoughts about that?
Global questions.
Yeah, it's a big question. Because I really see people go one way or the other, and they're both powerful.
And they are both powerful. And I think we need them all. And it's come back to an ecosystem. We don't, just having a monoculture doesn't work. And so, these various groups are all doing bits of the puzzle and working on things. And I think they all are additive. Sometimes, don't always agree with each other. Sometimes we're cross ways, but overall it's an additive process. And so I think we need everything. I always feel like, you're in a room and there's somebody that's just, you're like, wow, that person is a wackadoodle out there. But they create space. They're out here yapping about this, but the person that's a little more normal than them is more normal because of that person. And that person pushes the envelope sideways into what we all think about. And I'm not saying any group that we're talking about is wackadoodle or not, but it's like we all bring different viewpoints to that space. I tend to be an optimist, and I tend to be a moderate. And my dad was a district court judge. My mom was the farmer. So I think probably some of this comes from my dad's upbringing. But I still see a place for organics in the national landscape. I share the frustration that recommendations don't go into rulemaking, and we have to play politics with some of these things. And things we don't agree with are still approved. Absolutely frustrating. And then I also look at the side of, but we also have taxpayer money helping support organics that we wouldn't have otherwise. And we have fraud investigations that none of us would be able to look into. And we have Customs and Border Protection now looking at organic grain shipments that might be fraudulent. And that would be very hard for the private sector to do. So we have benefits and we have curses, and the problems are real. And I don't want to discount them; they're extremely frustrating. But I tend to look at them in the whole potpourri of things. I want to keep up the fight, and I think it's important. The Real Organic Project does what it does because it creates a baseline that we can look to and say, yes, this is important. We're ROP, we're a group that is fighting for soils and the benefits of that, and the benefits we don't even know of yet. And then that also helps us in the National Organic Coalition to say, as we're looking at rulemaking and looking at some other things, like, yes, this is how we can continuously improve. There are warts in organics. Yes, we need to continuously improve. This is the system we have right now. We don't have a good private system for certification. I don't know if we could fund it or not because already growers are saying it costs too much. So let's work on both sides of it. Let's try and make the current system better. And also let's poke the current system and say, you can do better.
Yeah. It's interesting, of course, Real Organic certification is free. And it's free because other people believe that it should be free and they donate money to make it so. Mm-hmm. And I think in some places, certainly in Europe, places like Denmark, certification is free because the taxpayers all pay for it. Yeah. And their level of support in terms of the amount per citizen is far greater than what is happening in the U.S. at this point.
Yeah, and Real Organic Project takes organic as the baseline too, and then adds to it.
Absolutely.
And if we had to pay for all the looks at organic certification, it would be a much bigger project and cost.
Yes, it would.
Could it be free?
Yeah.
And so I think we're building on that. I think I agree. And I think that's the argument now is, you go to Congress and say, well, you should pay for certification. It's like, well, why? But it's like, well, you're paying for crop insurance for big corn producers. You're paying for, as we said earlier, water treatment and environmental damage. It's harder to make in a congressional setting to make those links, but they're truly there. So the cost of certification is no more than the cost of what we're paying for all these other public services caused by poor agriculture.
Right.
But it's how do we make that point? And how do we win that battle?
Yeah.
But I think we need to keep reminding people that it's we're paying for things otherwise.
Right, right. And even the taxpayers, in terms of government programs, are paying for these things.
Yeah.
So where would you rather spend the money?
Yeah,
and being healthy.
Right. And if we're talking about obesity and healthcare,
yeah. Right.
So, but again, we're used to those single answer solutions, and in Congress especially wants that. But we need to keep making the point it's a complex system.
It is interesting. We were talking earlier about we're starting to see something new in Congress, which is a bipartisan movement to embrace the concept of organic, and it's new. This has not been until now. It's mostly been people on the progressive side of the Democratic Party who have actually been the champions of organic. And I don't mean that's not true in farmers. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of conservative organic farmers.
Absolutely.
But in terms of in Congress, I don't think it hasn't been there. And certainly, and people know that I am no great fan of Tom Vilsack. I think that he has done a lot of destruction to organic mm-hmm. in his first 8 years. In his last 4 years, he has not clarified the standards, but he has put some money into supporting transition to organic.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. I think that's a good step in the right direction. Do you think that it's possible that we're going to see something new coming down the road politically, where maybe that logjam is starting to be broken?
My crystal ball is a beta model.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think, let's come back to, you have a bell curve and you have the tips and the tails, and change happens on the edges. And so if we're in a situation where it's not normal, maybe change happens in unexpected ways. It's going to be interesting to see it play out, because there are interesting bedfellows that end up, from coming at things for different reasons, but for the same goal. Maybe this, transition isn't easy. Change isn't easy. Maybe this forces us to relook at some of our arguments and rephrase them or view them a little differently, and create different allies and different alliances. I don't know. I'll be curious. It's kind of watching like watching your kid grow up. You kind of, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of care, but you're also really curious how they're going to turn out. And I'm curious how this will turn out.
Yeah. All right. Steve, Ela, thank you very much. It's great to talk.
Always good to talk. It's a pleasure. And it's nice to think about these things.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. If you have a spare minute today, the single most effective way you can help us grow this movement and others to find this podcast is by leaving us a rating and a review wherever you listen to our podcast. You can find a video version of this interview on our website or on our YouTube channel, and you can join us every Sunday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. And if you haven't already, please sign up for our weekly newsletter at realorganicproject.org/email. See you next time.